Have you ever heard the sound of your own child dying over the phone? Not in a movie, not in a story someone tells you, but the real, ragged sound of a life you created being torn from the world. It is not a sound that fades with time. It becomes a permanent frequency, a low hum of horror that vibrates beneath every other sound you will ever hear again. My name is Lillian Hart, and this is not a cautionary tale. This is the geography of my grief, the map of a promise I made to a ghost. It began at 2:03 in the morning, an hour when the world is supposed to be quiet, when only bad news has the audacity to call. The phone on my nightstand was a black rectangle of silence, and then it shattered the peace with a single shrill ring, then another. I reached for it, my hand clumsy with sleep, and his voice, my Calvin's voice, spilled into the darkness. It was broken, shredded, a gasp for air in a world that had suddenly run out of it. "Mom," he whispered, and the word was a shard of glass. "Please, help me. They're not done." The air in my bedroom didn't just get cold, it turned to crystal. I felt it fracture in my lungs. My mind went blank and then exploded in 1,000 directions at once. Keys, I thought, fumbling on the dresser. Phone charger, my brain screamed, an absurdly practical thought in the face of absolute terror. I didn't need a charger. I needed a time machine. I needed to go back, 5 minutes, an hour, a day, to a time when his voice was whole. Through the speaker, his breathing was a storm. I could hear a distant, muffled sound, something metallic and cruel. "Calvin, baby, talk to me, where are you?" I was already moving, pulling on jeans over my pajamas, my feet finding shoes by memory alone. The GPS on his phone, the one we shared for emergencies, blinked like a malevolent star on my screen. It placed him by the river, near the old Franklin warehouse, a place that had been a tomb of rust and broken windows since the 1990s, a place where good things did not happen. I drove through red lights that had lost all meaning. They were just suggestions of a world that still had rules, a world I was no longer a part of. My world had shrunk to the sound of his breathing and the pulsing dot on my phone screen. I kept shouting his name into the speaker, a desperate mantra. "Calvin, stay with me. Talk to me, baby. Who is there? What did they do?" But there was no answer. Only the sound of a struggle, a faint groan, and then a silence that was more terrifying than any scream. If you are listening to this right now, I want you to pause for just a second. I want you to think about where you are, whether it is morning or night in your part of the world, because grief is a traveler. It respects no borders and observes no time zones. It arrives like a thief in the night, and it steals not just a person but the very sun from your sky. It is a storm that never, ever leaves. When I finally reached the warehouse, the moon was a coward, hiding behind a thick veil of clouds. The building loomed ahead, a skeletal silhouette against the bruised purple sky. A chain-link fence sagged, a section of it pulled back like a peeled-away scab, offering a dark invitation. I left my car running, the headlights cutting 2 useless beams into the oppressive dark. The main metal door groaned in protest as I shoved it open, its shriek echoing in the cavernous space inside. It smelled of damp earth, decay, and something metallic and sweet that my mind refused to name. A single, bare bulb flickered erratically overhead, casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the concrete walls, and then I saw him. He was lying under that broken light, a fallen soldier in a war I didn't know he was fighting. One of his expensive running shoes was missing. His shirt, a favorite blue one I had bought him for his birthday, was a dark, wet canvas of crimson. The world tilted and roared in my ears. I dropped to my knees beside him, the rough concrete biting into my skin. The sound that left my throat wasn't a word, it was an animal cry of pure agony. I pressed my hands against his chest, against wounds I couldn't count, couldn't comprehend. It was like trying to patch a dam with tissue paper. "Stay with me, Calvin," I begged, my voice cracking. "Look at me, sweetheart. Look at your mom." His eyes fluttered, beautiful hazel eyes that were now clouded with a pain no child should ever know. They struggled to focus on my face, to find an anchor in the storm that was claiming him. Then, with a strength that should have been impossible, a strength born from his last desperate moments on earth, he grabbed my wrist. His grip was iron. His eyes cleared for a single, terrifying second of pure clarity. He pulled me closer, his lips brushing against my ear. "Mom," he rasped. each word a monumental effort. My father-in-law did this. He sent them. The words were not a guess. They were a statement of fact, a dying declaration delivered with the last ounce of his life force. Each syllable sliced through the cold, dead air of that warehouse and embedded itself directly into my soul. Before I could process it, his hand went slack. His eyes lost their focus, and the light, the beautiful, vibrant light that was my son, went out. I screamed. I screamed until my throat felt like it was lined with shattered glass. I screamed for help, for a God I no longer believed in, for anyone who could hear me. Sirens wailed in the distance, a sound that was grotesquely too late. Someone must have heard my cries. When the paramedics finally arrived, they were a blur of uniforms and urgent, useless movements. They pulled me back as they worked on his still body, their voices a low, professional murmur. But I couldn't stop talking. I couldn't stop repeating his last words, clinging to them as if they were a lifeline. He said his father-in-law did this. "Write it down, please. You have to write it down." One police officer, an older man with tired eyes, nodded, his pen moving on a small notepad. For a moment, a sliver of hope pierced through my despair. They were listening. But then a younger officer whispered something to him, and the entire atmosphere shifted. The air grew colder, more clinical. The younger one actively avoided my gaze. "Ma'am," he said, his voice laced with a careful, practiced sort of pity. "Your son was barely conscious. Let's not jump to any conclusions." His words were a dismissal, a pat on the head for the hysterical mother. I watched in a daze as they bagged his phone, slid his wallet into an evidence pouch, and talked quietly amongst themselves near their patrol car, their radios crackling with codes I didn't understand. My son, my Calvin, was still warm beside me, and they were already changing the story. A detective, a man with a tailored suit and an indifferent expression named Keller, came over. "Mrs. Hart," he said, his voice smooth and detached. "Do you have any idea who might want to hurt your son?" The question was so absurd, so insulting, that for a moment I couldn't speak. "I just told you," I finally choked out, my voice rising. "I told your officer. He said his father-in-law, Gerald Mercer, did this. He said it himself." The detective made a small note in his book, a meaningless scribble. "We'll certainly review the statement," he said, closing the notebook with a soft click that sounded like a coffin lid shutting. "But for now, ma'am, this has all the hallmarks of a robbery gone wrong." A robbery. The word hung in the air, a blatant, suffocating lie. I looked down at my son. His expensive watch was still on his wrist. His car keys were in his pocket. His other shoe was just a few feet away. Robbers do not leave behind items of value. They do not leave behind a story. My eyes fell on his phone, which had fallen from his hand. The screen was cracked, a spiderweb of fractures across its dark surface, slick with his blood. Through the cracks, the screen was still faintly lit, displaying a half-typed message. The recipient was me. The message read, "Mom, if I don't make it, tell them." And that was it. The message ended there, cut short by violence. Before they could notice, before they could bag this final, desperate piece of him, my fingers moved with a will of their own. I discreetly ejected the small backup SIM card from its slot on the side of the phone. Maybe it was an obstruction of justice. Maybe it was a mother's instinct to save the last piece of her child's voice. In that moment, I didn't care. It was survival. They began taping off the area, their yellow tape a flimsy barrier against an ocean of truth. A plainclothes officer folded the tape across the warehouse door and muttered into his radio, loud enough for me to hear. "Got a dying declaration, but it's unclear. Looks like a robbery. Possible gang involvement." I knew then. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that the official report was being written in real time, and it was a work of fiction. The ambulance finally pulled away, its red and blue lights cutting silently through the morning fog, carrying away the empty shell of my child. I stood alone in a puddle of grimy water that reflected the flashing lights, a distorted, fractured portrait of a woman whose world had just been utterly and completely destroyed. When I finally found the strength to sit in my car, my hands didn't feel like my own. They were trembling, alien things as I dialed my brother's number. He was a detective once, before he retired. He was one of the good ones, a man who still believed that evidence doesn't lie. Even when people do. Thomas, I said when he answered, my voice a hollow echo of itself. "Calvin's gone." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that is filled with 1,000 unasked questions. Then his voice, steady and calm, cut through my haze. "Lillian, what did he say? What were his last words?" I stared at the flashing police lights shrinking in my rearview mirror, becoming distant, indifferent stars. "He said his father-in-law did this," I whispered. "And Thomas, they just called it a robbery." I could hear my brother breathing, a slow, deliberate rhythm. Then his voice came back, hard as steel. "Stay right where you are. Do not say another word to any of them. I'm on my way." In that moment, I understood for the first time how power can rewrite truth, how money can wash away blood. They had taped off the wrong crime scene. The real crime scene was the lie they were already telling. My son was dead, and the truth was dying right there beside him. There is a unique kind of silence that fills a chapel during the funeral of someone taken too soon. It is not a peaceful silence. It is heavy, suffocating, thick with unspoken questions and the cloying, sweet scent of lilies. Lilies and lies. That was the smell of my son's funeral. I sat 2 rows from the front, a ghost in a black dress, and felt like the only person in the entire building who was truly awake. Everyone else was participating in a well-rehearsed play, but I was watching from the wings, noticing every missed cue, every false note. In the front row sat Chloe, my daughter-in-law, the grieving widow. She was a portrait of perfect, cinematic sorrow. Dressed in black silk that seemed to drink the light from the room, her shoulders trembled in flawless rhythm with the mournful organ music. It was a masterful performance, one she must have practiced in front of a mirror. Behind her, a protective hand on her shoulder, stood Gerald Mercer. He was the man my son had named with his dying breath. He was not crying, he wasn't even pretending to. He possessed the kind of profound stillness that very rich men wear to funerals they have paid for, a stillness that projects power and utter emotional detachment. It was the calm of a predator who has just fed. I stared at the back of his expensive tailored suit, at the way his thumb occasionally brushed against Chloe's collarbone, a gesture far too intimate, too familiar for a grieving stepfather and his daughter-in-law. I watched them, and I wondered how love could curdle so quietly, how a marriage could become a motive for murder. The police had officially classified Calvin's case as a probable robbery pending further investigation, a bureaucratic phrase that meant it was already collecting dust in a forgotten file cabinet. The detective's preliminary report, which Thomas had managed to get a glimpse of through an old contact, had conveniently omitted the most important detail of all, the last words my son ever said. After the eulogies, a series of hollow, beautiful speeches that described a version of my son the speakers had barely known, people formed a line to offer their condolences. They filed past me, their faces etched with a soft, uncomfortable pity, and spoke the useless, empty sentences that people say when they are faced with the abyss of someone else's loss. "He's in a better place now. God needed another angel. At least his suffering is over." Each phrase was like sandpaper on my raw soul. Each well-intentioned word scraped away another layer of my sanity. Then, a figure in the line made my blood run cold. It was Detective Keller, the man from the warehouse, now wearing a suit that was far too expensive for a public servant's paycheck. "Mrs. Hart," he murmured, his voice a low, confidential hum. He gently steered me toward a quiet corner of the chapel, away from the procession of mourners, to a small alcove where the sound of weeping couldn't quite reach. "We're still actively working the case," he assured me, his eyes failing to meet mine. "But sometimes, in these situations, the best thing to do is to let time do its job. You'll only make yourself sick chasing shadows." The condescension in his voice was so thick I could have choked on it. "Is that your official advice, Detective? Or is it a message from Mr. Mercer?" The question slipped out, sharp and venomous, before I could stop myself. A tiny muscle in his jaw twitched, the only sign that my words had landed. "I beg your pardon. I told your officers exactly what my son said." I pressed on, my voice low and trembling with a rage that was starting to eclipse my grief. "And your report called it an unclear statement." He exhaled slowly through his nose, a polite, dismissive sound that was meant to put me in my place. "Ma'am, sometimes grief can make us hear things," he said, his tone softening into a patronizing calm. "It can make us hear more than the dying ever meant to say." "And sometimes, Detective," I replied, my voice as cold as the marble floor beneath my feet. "Power erases what they did say." He did not have an answer for that. He just straightened his tie, a small nervous gesture, and gave me a tight professional smile before walking away. He moved directly toward the front row, toward the widow and her benefactor. I watched as Chloe, upon seeing him, collapsed into another round of perfectly timed sobs, burying her face in Gerald's chest. The photographers, who had been lingering at the back of the church, surged forward. Their cameras clicked and flashed, a frantic, predatory sound, as if they were documenting a red carpet event instead of a burial. She looked radiant in her misery, her mascara artfully streaked, a tragic starlet in the spotlight. He placed a hand on the small of her back, his thumb tracing idle, possessive circles against the silk of her dress. I stood there, frozen in my corner, completely numb. The world was moving on. The narrative was being set in stone, all without my permission. People began to file out of the chapel, heading toward the graveside service. As the crowd shuffled past, I felt something press into my hand. It was a small, folded piece of paper, slipped into my palm with a speed and subtlety that was almost invisible. I turned, startled. But whoever had given it to me was already gone, lost in the slow-moving river of black-clad mourners. My heart began to pound a frantic, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I waited until I was alone, standing near the casket where my son lay, before my trembling fingers dared to open it. The paper was folded into a tiny, tight square, the size of a business card. I unfolded it. 5 words were scrawled in neat black ink. He knew they were watching. And at the bottom of the note, a single, cryptic initial, N. My knees nearly gave out. The handwriting was not Calvin's. It was unfamiliar. I frantically scanned the remaining crowd, my eyes searching the faces, now blurred by the glare of the late morning sun streaming through the stained glass windows. Everyone carried flowers, symbols of grief and remembrance, but only one of them had left me instructions. I quickly slipped the note into my purse just as the priest began the final prayer, my mind reeling. When they lowered my son's coffin into the cold, dark earth, I did not cry. My tears had frozen somewhere deep inside me, replaced by a glacial certainty. I just kept staring at Chloe's hand, now gripping Gerald's arm tightly, and his thumb, still tracing those slow, circular patterns against her skin. After the service, as the crowd dispersed, Detective Keller approached me one last time, holding out his business card. "Call me if you remember anything else," he said, his expression unreadable. "I already remember everything," I replied, and turned my back on him. The sleek black limousine pulled away from the curb, carrying the grieving widow and her wealthy stepfather down the winding cemetery road. Reporters swarmed their car like vultures, their camera flashes painting white, ghostly streaks on my retinas. I stood alone in the empty parking lot long after everyone else had gone, the small, mysterious note burning a hole in my pocket. My son had died whispering a name. The police had deliberately turned his final words into static. And now, a complete stranger at his funeral had just confirmed my deepest, darkest fear. Calvin had seen this coming. He knew he was in danger. And nobody, absolutely nobody, had believed him. Have you ever held something that once belonged to a person who is gone and realized that the object itself still holds a piece of their life? That is what it felt like when the coroner's clerk handed me Calvin's personal effects in a plain brown evidence envelope. It was sealed and stamped, like a secret that the city wanted to keep buried. I had only gone to the county building for the death certificate, for the mundane paperwork that follows an unimaginable tragedy. They had told me I could collect his belongings, since the case was now officially closed. Those 2 words, "case closed," hit me with the force of a physical blow. They echoed in the sterile, disinfectant-scented hallway with a brutal finality. My son's blood was still a vivid stain in my memory, a ghost on my hands, and they had the audacity, the sheer, unmitigated gall, to call it finished. The clerk, a young woman with tired eyes, did not look at me as she slid the envelope across the worn linoleum counter. "We logged it as item 47, she recited in a monotone voice. "Detective Keller signed off on the release 2 days ago." "Detective Keller," I repeated, the name tasting like ash in my mouth. "Yes, ma'am," she said, already turning away. I managed to thank her and left before my voice could crack, before the rage and grief could spill out of me right there in that cold, indifferent government building. Outside, the afternoon sun felt like an insult. It was too bright, too cheerful, as if the world had not received the news that my son was gone. I sat in my car, the engine off, and tore open the seal on the envelope. Inside, nestled in a clear plastic bag, were his keys, his watch with the cracked face, and his phone. I took the phone out. The screen was shattered, a web of dark veins splitting his dark reflection from my own. I pressed the power button, not expecting anything. But it blinked to life, the battery icon flashing a defiant red, holding on to the last vestiges of its charge. There was one new file on his voice recorder application. It was untitled, and it was 31 seconds long. My breath hitched in my chest. With a trembling finger, I pressed play. The first thing I heard was his breathing, fast and uneven, the sound of a man running out of time. Then there was static, a harsh, crackling sound, like a storm trying to speak. In the background, a man's voice shouted something, the words muffled and indistinct. Then Calvin's voice came through, faint and fractured, a whisper from the other side. "Mom, if this cuts out," he gasped, "Pine and Lake." Then the recording ended in an abrupt silence. I played it again. And again. The same fragments, the same desperate, cryptic message. No more, no less. Every time, it stopped at Pine and Lake. I had no idea what it meant. Was it a street name? A business? A code? But the way he said it, the urgency in his dying breath, told me it was not random. It was a clue. It was a breadcrumb left by a dying man who knew, who trusted, that I would come looking for the trail. Before I could process it further, the phone buzzed in my hand. A system message popped up on the broken screen. "System file corrupt. Restore from last backup." I instinctively tapped no. I couldn't trust anything, especially not a machine, that might erase the only piece of my son's voice that I had left. When I finally arrived home, my brother Thomas was waiting on my front porch, drinking a cup of coffee as if the world was still a logical, sensible place. His presence was a small, solid anchor in the chaotic sea of my grief. I walked up the steps and handed him the evidence envelope without a word. "They called it a robbery," I said, my voice flat. Then I handed him the official report I had just picked up. "You want to see something interesting?" He set his cup down and opened the folder. His eyes, the sharp, analytical eyes of a seasoned detective, scanned the first page. The first line read, "Cause of death, blunt force trauma sustained during an apparent robbery attempt." The second line read, "Victim's dying statement was recorded but deemed unclear." "Unclear," I whispered, the word a fresh stab of pain. I told them exactly what he said. "My father-in-law did this. There is nothing unclear about that sentence, Thomas." He skimmed the rest of the report, his jaw tightening with each page he turned. "This isn't a police report, Lillian," he said finally, his voice low and hard. "This is a burial on paper." "What does that mean?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "It means Keller or someone pulling his strings cleaned this document before it was ever officially filed. They completely removed your witness statement. They invented a new narrative to fit their agenda, and then they stamped it as solved to make sure no one else would ever look at it." He pointed to the bottom corner of the last page. There, in bold blue ink, was the word I had heard at the coroner's office, the word that had become my new enemy. Closed. My stomach plummeted. "How can they bury the truth that fast?" "With money," he said quietly, his eyes meeting mine, "and a man like Gerald Mercer has an endless supply of it." The name hung in the air between us, heavy and toxic, like smoke from a fire. I took out Calvin's phone and played the 31-second recording for him. We both sat there in the fading afternoon light, listening to my son's voice fade in and out, a ghost in the machine. When it stopped, Thomas leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. "Pine and Lake," he repeated, turning the words over. "It could be a company, it could be a location. It was the one thing he wanted you to know. I think he knew they would try to erase everything else." Thomas nodded slowly. "Then that is exactly where we start." I looked at the police report again, my finger tracing the word closed until the blue ink began to smear under my thumb. It was not just an official designation, it was a threat. It was a clear warning that the system was not going to help me. In fact, it would bury me right next to my son if I continued to ask questions. But what they, in their arrogance and their power, had failed to understand was that a mother's love does not obey warnings. We do not stop asking questions. We just find a different way to ask them. I carefully folded the fraudulent report, slid it into a drawer next to the stranger's note from the funeral, and pressed my son's broken phone to my chest. His voice, fractured and fading, echoed in my mind. Pine and Lake. They had buried his body, and they had tried to bury the truth right along with it. But my son had planted a seed. And I would burn the whole world down to make sure it had the chance to grow. My brother has a rule from his days on the force, a mantra he lived by through years of navigating the murky waters of crime and corruption. Never start a war until you have mapped the battlefield. So the first call I made wasn't to a lawyer, or a journalist, or even to the police commissioner. It was to Thomas. He showed up at my front door 2 hours later, looking less like a retired detective and more like a ghost from a past life. He wore his old, cracked leather jacket. His hair was more gray than I remembered, but his eyes were still the same, sharp and clear, with an unsettling ability to see through lies. He did not hug me. He was never a man for comforting gestures in moments of crisis. Instead, he walked past me into the kitchen and simply said, "You got any coffee?" We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where Calvin used to sit, raiding the fridge for midnight snacks and telling me about his dreams. The silence in the room was a living thing, filled with his absence. I laid everything out on the polished wood surface, a grim collection of artifacts from my son's last hours, the broken phone, the falsified police report, the audio recording of his last words, and the cryptic note from the funeral. It was a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Thomas listened, his face an unreadable mask, as I recounted every detail, from the phone call to my encounter with Detective Keller at the cemetery. He did not interrupt me once. When I finished, the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall, each second marking the growing distance from the moment my son was still alive. He reached for the police report first, flipping to the last page. A small, humorless smirk touched his lips, the kind of expression a detective gets when they can smell a lie from a mile away. "They stamped this case closed faster than a parking ticket," he said, his voice dry. "They erased his dying words," I replied, my own voice barely a whisper. He nodded, his eyes scanning the document again. "Then we don't go back to them. Not directly. Not yet. We build our own case first. That's your rule," I remembered. "That's survival," he corrected. Thomas still had a few contacts inside the department, the quiet, overlooked people who worked in the background, the ones who owed him favors from the old days. He pulled out his phone and called one of them, a desk sergeant who had worked in the evidence control unit for 20 years. I listened to his side of the conversation, catching only fragments of the puzzle. "Mercer case. No, not that Mercer. Warehouse file from last week. Already sealed." He was silent for a long moment, listening. Then he hung up and looked at me, his eyes dark. "Gerald Mercer made a sizable donation to the precinct 3 months ago. A complete renovation of their main conference room. Guess which captain's name is on the shiny brass thank you plaque?" "Keller," I said without a moment of hesitation. Thomas gave a dry, bitter laugh. "You're learning fast, Lil." I wanted to scream. I wanted to smash something. My son's murder investigation was being buried, archived, and forgotten, all under a plaque that bore the name of his killer. He leaned forward across the table, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial tone. "You said Calvin mentioned Pine and Lake in that recording. I did a quick search on my way over here. Pine and Lake LLC was registered as a new business 6 months ago. It has a Delaware mailing address, 0 listed employees, and no physical office. Guess who's listed on the parent company filings? Who?" He slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a printout from a corporate registration database. The document showed a complex web of shell companies, but at the very top of the pyramid, listed as the primary shareholder of the parent company, was a familiar name, Mercer Holdings Group. My pulse, which had been a dull, steady throb of grief, kicked into a frantic, angry rhythm. "Gerald's business empire," I asked, my voice tight. "Buried under 6 layers of corporate misdirection, but yes, it's his," Thomas said, his finger tapping the paper. "And here's the interesting part. Pine and Lake was officially created just 1 week before Calvin's company signed that big new consulting contract he was so excited about. They used it to funnel money out, Lillian, quietly and cleanly." I felt a wave of nausea. The pieces were starting to click into place, forming a picture that was uglier than I could have imagined. The money, the silence, the power. But what hurt the most, what truly twisted the knife in my heart, was the realization that Calvin must have discovered this. He must have seen what was happening, and no one, not his wife, not his colleagues, had believed him. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice small. "We gather," he said, his tone all business now. Paper first, people later. "We are going to build a file so clean, so airtight, that it cannot be dismissed or buried. No noise, no emotion, just cold, hard proof." And after that, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant, looking at something only he could see. After that, we let the evidence do the talking. Because when power is used to protect guilt, the only thing that can embarrass it into submission is the truth. He began to outline our strategy, what we would need to find. Bank statements, shell company registrations, any and all communication linking Mercer Holdings to the Pine and Lake entity. I took notes, my handwriting shaky at first, but growing steadier, more resolute with every word he spoke. At one point, I had to ask, "Thomas, do you think Detective Keller knows the truth?" He hesitated for a long moment. "Keller doesn't need to know the whole truth," he said finally. "He just needs to obey. Men like Mercer don't buy loyalty, Lillian. They lease it, one compromised soul at a time." That sentence stayed with me, a chilling summary of the world my son had stumbled into. We spent the rest of that evening and the next several days cross-checking public records, digging through online databases, and piecing together the financial puzzle. Every new document we uncovered, every digital breadcrumb we followed, pointed to Mercer's name, or at least to his long dark shadow. And for the first time since I had stood in that cold, desolate warehouse, I felt something beginning to burn alongside my grief. It was direction. It was purpose. Late one night, Thomas printed out the Pine and Lake registration document and pinned it to the corkboard on my kitchen wall, right where I used to keep Calvin's report cards and art projects. The faint watermark of the Mercer Holdings logo seemed to glow under the dim lamplight. He stood back, folding his arms across his chest. "Now you see it," he said grimly. "See what?" He looked at me, a grim, sad smile on his face. "Your son didn't just stumble into a river of dirty money, Lil. He stumbled into a river that had been professionally laundered, sanitized, and disinfected by the very people who were supposed to be protecting him." The air inside Calvin's old office had changed. It no longer smelled of ambition, of late-night coffee, and the electric hum of creation. Now, it smelled of dust, neglect, and the particular kind of silence that descends on a place after everyone has learned to avoid making eye contact. His name was still on the frosted glass of the door. Calvin Hart, Product Development Lead. But the edges of the vinyl letters were starting to peel away, as if even the building itself wanted to forget he had ever been there. I had not been back to his workplace since the company's sponsored memorial service. Every step down the long, quiet hallway felt heavier than the last, each footfall an echo in an empty space. Thomas waited in the car. He had said I would get more honest answers if I went in alone. People tend to lie less, he had reasoned, when they believe they are comforting a grieving mother. I didn't know if his logic was brilliant or cruel. Perhaps it was both. The receptionist, a young woman named Sarah, recognized me instantly. Her professionally pleasant smile faltered, replaced by a wide-eyed panic. "Mrs. Hart," she stammered. I didn't know you were coming in today." "Neither did I said, my voice softer than I intended. "I need to speak with the company accountant for a moment. Mr. Vance, is he in?" Her fingers hovered over the intercom button on her desk, her eyes darting nervously down the hall. Then she seemed to make a decision. She leaned forward and whispered, "He's in his office." "Last door on the right." She buzzed me through the security door without another word. The door to Mr. Vance's office was slightly ajar. I could see him inside, a man in his late 30s, with sweat already gathering at his temples, even though the office air conditioning was humming loudly enough to chill a glass of water. He looked up as I entered, and a pained, forced smile stretched across his face. It did not come close to reaching his eyes. "Mrs. Hart, goodness, I am so sorry for your loss." It was a terrible tragedy. I simply nodded and sat down in the chair opposite his desk without waiting for an invitation. "You handled Calvin's departmental payroll, is that correct? And his vendor payments?" He hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the door. Yes, ma'am. I did. Until everything happened. I reached into my purse and placed the copy of the Pine and Lake LLC registration document on his desk. His pupils dilated, a sudden, sharp expansion of black in his watery blue eyes. It was the reaction of a man who has just seen a ghost holding a document with his own signature on it. You recognize this company, don't you, Mr. Vance? Where did you... he started to say, then stopped himself, catching the words before they could escape. The sheen of sweat on his forehead thickened. That's one of our new consulting partners, he stammered, shuffling papers on his desk for no reason. Consulting for what, exactly? He reached for his water bottle, took a long, desperate gulp, and choked slightly. I'm not entirely sure of all the specifics, Mrs. Hart. A lot of those larger contracts are handled directly by senior management. Sometimes, things get mislabeled in the system. Mislabeled for $42,000. I slid another piece of paper across his desk. It was a copy of a ledger page that Thomas had managed to acquire, showing a single payment. I had circled the entry in red ink. Consulting fee, Pine and Lake LLC, $42,000. That isn't a typo, Mr. Vance. That is theft disguised as a business expense. His breathing grew shallow, quick. You shouldn't have that document, he whispered, his voice trembling. And your conscience shouldn't be making you this nervous, I replied, my own voice quiet and steady. He dabbed at his forehead with a crumpled tissue, his eyes darting back and forth between me and the door, as if he was calculating his chances of making a run for it. Look, Mrs. Hart, you need to understand. Some payments. They come with specific instructions. Sometimes we are told not to ask questions. Who is they? I don't know any names, he said, speaking quickly now, the words tumbling out of him. It came down through an internal routing channel. Someone connected to the family. The family, I repeated, my voice calm, though my pulse was pounding in my ears. He nodded quickly, relieved that I seemed to understand. Someone who married into it. They said it was for a private consultancy, a personal favor kind of arrangement. They just told me to code the payment to Pine and Lake and to leave it alone. He attempted a small, weak laugh, but it came out as a dry, cracking sound. It's just normal stuff in big business. You know how these powerful families are. My family, I said quietly, leaning forward slightly, doesn't hire shell companies to launder its blood money. He flinched as if I had physically struck him. I stood up, taking the ledger page back before he could instinctively reach for it. Thank you for your time, Mr. Vance. You have been very helpful. As I walked toward the door, I heard him call out after me, his voice a pleading, terrified whisper. Mrs. Hart, please, don't mention my name to anyone. They'll know I was the one who talked. I paused in the doorway, my back still to him. Who is they, Mr. Vance? His lips parted, but no sound came out. Only a thick, heavy silence followed me as I walked back down the long, empty hallway. Outside, the sun was bright. Thomas was leaning against the car, his arms folded. You were in there for 15 minutes, he observed. He talked, I said, sliding into the passenger seat. Well, he sweated more than he talked, but I got what I needed. Thomas started the engine. Anything useful. I stared out the window at the gleaming glass office building that had once represented my son's brightest dreams. He said someone who married into the family told him to bury the payment and keep his mouth shut. Thomas frowned, navigating the car out of the parking lot. Married into the family. I nodded, watching the city lights begin to blur past us as we drove into the encroaching twilight. He said someone from the family, but he wouldn't say who. The knock on my front door came just after 9 that evening. It was a soft, polite knock, the kind of knock that guilt makes when it is wearing expensive perfume. I opened the door, expecting to see Thomas, but it was Chloe. She was dressed in a muted gray dress, her blonde hair pulled back in an elegant, severe bun. Her eyes were red-rimmed but conspicuously dry. She held a casserole dish in one hand and a carefully constructed expression of pity in the other. I didn't know if you had eaten, she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound human. I simply stared at her for a full 5 seconds, a silent eternity stretching between us, before I stepped aside and let her in. The house, my house, suddenly felt smaller, claustrophobic, with her presence inside it. Every wall seemed to be leaning in, listening. She placed the dish on the kitchen counter and looked around the room, a slow, deliberate survey, as if she were a tourist visiting a historical site. "It's still the same," she whispered, a wistful, nostalgic tone in her voice. "Calvin loved this house so much." I did not answer. She had used that exact same line at the funeral. I wondered if she had a script she was working from, rehearsing her lines in the mirror each morning. We sat across from each other at the dining room table, the same table where Calvin had proudly introduced her to me for the first time, his face alight with a nervous, hopeful love. Now, that same table was a desolate, polished battlefield, separating two women who were divided by death and by pretense. She clasped her hands together on the table, a picture of delicate sorrow. "Lillian, I know we haven't always seen eye to eye, but I truly want us to heal from this. I want there to be peace between us." "Peace," I repeated, the word tasting like poison on my tongue. I let it hang in the air, settling between us like a layer of dust. "My son is in the ground, Chloe, and you brought a casserole. You think that is what peace looks like?" Her lower lip began to tremble, a flawless imitation of someone on the verge of tears. "You think this doesn't hurt me too?" I was his wife. I studied her face carefully. The grief she was wearing didn't fit her properly. It was like a borrowed coat, tailored for a stage performance, not for the harsh reality of everyday wear. "You told the detectives that Calvin left the house around 10 o'clock that night, didn't you?" "Yes," she said, a little too quickly. "He said he needed to get some air, to clear his head." "Strange," I said, my voice deliberately casual. "Because the security cameras from the building across from the warehouse caught movement around 11. The coroner's report estimated that he had already been attacked by then." Her eyes flickered, just for a fraction of a second, a tiny, almost imperceptible shift. I must have gotten the time wrong. I wasn't looking at a clock." "Funny thing about time, Chloe," I said, watching her closely. "You always seem to notice it when it benefits you." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Thomas had called me earlier that day. He had been digging into traffic camera footage and municipal records. He had found something. An image of a parking ticket issued for an illegally parked car on the street right outside the old Franklin warehouse. The car was a black Mercedes. The license plate was registered to Chloe Mercer. And the timestamp on the ticket was 11:02 p.m., just about an hour before I found my son bleeding to death on the cold concrete floor. I hadn't told her about the ticket yet. I wanted to see how much rope she would use to hang herself first. She leaned forward, her voice becoming small, pleading. "I just wanted to say that I'm sorry for everything, for how things ended between us. He was so distant during those last few weeks. Angry, paranoid. I think he was hiding things from me." "Oh, he was definitely hiding things," I said, watching her reaction like a hawk, "and I think he was hiding them from you." Her hand, which had been reaching for a glass of water, froze in midair. The smallest muscle in her jaw twitched, a tiny, involuntary betrayal, before she forced a brittle smile. "You always did have a way with words, Lillian. I've learned from people who use them far too easily," I replied. She laughed softly, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "You've changed. So have you," I said. My gaze drifted down to her wrist, and then I froze. She was wearing Calvin's watch. The one with the distinctive silver band and the blue face. I had seen it in the crime scene evidence photos. I had seen the blood smeared along the strap. Now, it gleamed under my kitchen light, spotless and pristine, ticking away calmly as if nothing had ever happened. "That's a nice watch," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. She followed my gaze and instinctively tugged at the sleeve of her dress, but it was too late. "Oh, this," she said, trying to sound casual. He left it at home that night. I just couldn't bear to see it just sitting there on his nightstand." I stood up slowly, my chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. "He was wearing that watch when I found him, Chloe." Her eyes darted toward the front door, the hunted look of an animal searching for an escape route. "You must be mistaken. Your grief is making you misremember things. I never, ever forget the details of the last night I saw my son breathing." For the first time that evening, her voice lost its practiced, gentle softness and became hard, sharp. "You're angry. I understand that. But making these wild accusations against me won't bring him back." No, I said, my own voice now as cold and hard as steel. But finding the truth just might let his soul rest. She quickly gathered her purse and began backing toward the hallway. I should go. This was clearly a mistake. Not for me, I murmured, just loud enough for her to hear. The front door clicked shut behind her. I walked to the window and watched her black Mercedes pull away from the curb, its red taillights disappearing into the dark, indifferent night. My hands were trembling, but not from grief this time. It was from the cold, hard certainty of the truth. Minutes later, my phone buzzed with a text message from Thomas. Got the certified copy of the ticket. 11:02 p.m. Same car, same plate. I looked back at the empty dining room table. The casserole sat there, untouched, its warm, comforting smell now seeming cloying and sour. She had come to my home pretending to comfort me, wearing the same watch that my son had died in. Grief has its own rhythm. You wake up, you ache, you force yourself to breathe because your body insists on it. Then, just when the world starts to feel remotely normal again, just when the silence in the house starts to feel less like an accusation, something happens that jolts the rhythm completely offbeat. For me, that jolt came in the form of an email from Calvin. It arrived in my inbox exactly 30 days after the night he died, arriving with the silent precision of a ghost keeping an appointment. The subject line was stark and chilling. If you're reading this, open carefully. I froze, halfway through pouring my morning coffee, the mug trembling in my hand. I read the sender's address 3 times, tracing the letters of his name with my eyes. It was his full name, his personal domain, an account that had been untouched since the police had seized all of his devices. I sat down at the kitchen table, my heart thudding against my ribs like a trapped bird. Thomas was in the living room, meticulously reviewing traffic citations from the night of the murder. "Tom," I called out, my voice strained, "you need to see this." He joined me at the table, leaning over my shoulder to read the screen. The body of the email was short, almost clinical in its tone. "If I am gone for 30 days with no activity on this account, this file will unlock automatically. Do not delete this. Open it on a secure network. The password is the name of the person I told you to never, ever trust." Attached to the email was a single, password-protected zip file named simply Failsafe. I looked at the email's footer, at the automated timestamp. It had been sent at 3:16 a.m., exactly 30 days prior, the same time the coroner had estimated as Calvin's time of death. Thomas let out a sharp, astonished breath. He set up a dead man's switch. I looked up at him, the implications of his words crashing down on me. He planned for this, Thomas. He knew. He knew someone might make him disappear. I stared at the screen, at my son's name printed there, a digital ghost returning to finish the sentence that had been violently cut short. What do we do? Thomas rubbed his temples, a gesture of deep thought and deeper weariness. We wait. If we try to open it now on an unsecured network, we risk tripping whatever secondary security layer he built into it. 30 days means he wanted a buffer. Maybe he wanted the people who did this to him to get comfortable, to feel safe, to feel untouchable first. I scrolled down and saw one more line of text in the email, in a smaller font, almost like a postscript. "If this ever reaches you, Mom, I'm sorry. I'm sorry you had to see the world the way I saw it." That was when my hands started shaking for real. My son, my brilliant, beautiful son, had written me a goodbye letter in advance, and in my own grief and distraction, I had never truly noticed just how scared he must have been in those final weeks. Thomas printed the email and placed it reverently into a new folder, which he labeled Failsafe Evidence. Then he looked me dead in the eye. "From this moment on, Lillian, we do this my way. No more showing our hand to anyone, no more confronting people. We gather, we watch, and we wait for that file to unlock." I nodded, swallowing the hard lump that had formed in my throat. "The password," I said, thinking aloud. "He said the password is the name of the person he told me never to trust." Thomas frowned. "Who did he say that about specifically?" I closed my eyes, searching my memory, pushing past the fog of grief to small conversations over dinner, the slight, almost imperceptible unease in his voice whenever certain names came up. "He said it once," I whispered, remembering a family dinner a few months back. He told me, "Mom, don't ever trust anyone who pretends that family is just another form of business." Thomas leaned back, a slow, grim understanding dawning on his face. That's Gerald Mercer's entire biography in a single sentence. For the next few weeks, we lived in a state of suspended animation, in a silence that was not peaceful but fraught with a tense, coiled anticipation. Thomas, with his old law enforcement credentials, managed to get access to Calvin's cloud server logs. He traced multiple login attempts to the Failsafe account. Twice, from 2 different IP addresses, someone else had tried and failed to access the account. Both IP addresses traced back to a corporate server farm in the city where Mercer's main firm operated. He printed the log entries and laid them out on the kitchen table like a hand of damning cards. "They know this file exists," he said, his voice grave. "They're waiting, just like we are. Maybe they think they can intercept it and delete it before we ever get to see it." I kept checking the countdown timer that Calvin, in his foresight, had coded into the email's metadata. Every morning, the number of days, hours, and minutes ticked down, a slow, agonizing clock that was counting toward either justice or a deeper despair. On the 28th day, I dreamed of Calvin. He was standing in the kitchen, barefoot, with the morning sunlight on his face, looking young and happy. "You always told me the truth eventually comes out, Mom," he said in the dream. "This time, it just needs a little help finding the door." I woke up with my cheeks wet with tears, the house feeling quieter, emptier than ever before. 2 days later, I woke up, made coffee, and opened my laptop. The notification on the email had changed. The word scheduled was gone. In its place was a single, beautiful word: unlocked. Thomas stood behind me, his hand on my shoulder. "You ready?" I was not ready, but I nodded anyway. My finger hovered over the file icon, the weight of the entire world, of my son's stolen future, pressing down on that one single point. Calvin had outsmarted the people who killed him. He had planned for a world that had refused to believe him. Now, from beyond the grave, he was finally going to have his say. You learn a great deal about the nature of fear when you make the deliberate choice to make powerful men nervous. It does not begin with a loud explosion or a public confrontation. It begins quietly, with something as simple as an email you should not send. I sat in front of my laptop, staring at the anonymous tip submission form for a major national newspaper for nearly an hour before my fingers finally began to move. I typed the words that I knew would change everything, the words that would ignite a fire that could not be contained. I have evidence directly linking Gerald Mercer's company, Mercer Holdings, to a shell corporation known as Pine and Lake LLC. This is the same shell firm implicated in the ongoing investigation of the Calvin Hart case. I attached no name, left no digital trace of my identity. It was just the truth, stripped of my grief, my rage, and my fingerprints. Thomas did not approve of this tactic. "You're poking a sleeping bear with a lit matchstick, Lillian," he had warned, pacing anxiously behind me. "Then let him smell the smoke," I had replied. I attached 3 documents to the anonymous tip: the Pine and Lake ledger page showing the $42,000 payment, the corporate registration clearly linking the shell company to Mercer Holdings, and a scanned image of the consulting payment authorization. It was not everything we had, but it was enough. It was enough to make someone at the very top of the food chain lose a great deal of sleep. When I finally hit the send button, it felt like taking a breath after being held underwater for a very, very long time. The next morning, my burner phone, the one Thomas had insisted I use, buzzed with a message from an unknown encrypted number. "We have received your submission. Verification is currently underway." And just like that, the world tilted slightly on its axis. By that evening, the whispers had started online. They appeared on obscure financial blogs, on anonymous subreddits, on dark corners of the internet where people who understood the flow of money talked. People were starting to connect dots that I had not even drawn for them. Someone with inside information leaked that Pine and Lake LLC had been quietly and hastily dissolved just 2 days after Calvin's death. Someone else, an amateur stock market analyst, pointed out the sudden, unexplained dip in Mercer Holdings' stock value that very same week. The following day, Thomas brought home a printed draft of the story, obtained from one of his old, trusted contacts in the press. The headline made my hands shake so badly I could barely hold the paper. "Shell firm linked to tech executive's death." Beneath it was a blurry, smiling photo of Calvin, taken from an old company profile. "This will rattle their cage," Thomas had said, his voice a low murmur. "But we cannot get caught holding the match." "We won't," I had said, though my voice lacked the conviction I was trying to project. 2 days later, I learned just how loud and menacing silence can become when powerful people start watching your every move. I had stopped by the grocery store that Thursday evening, trying my best to perform the role of a normal woman, a woman whose son's death was not about to become a national headline. But as I walked through the parking lot, I saw it. Chloe's black Mercedes. She was parked near the entrance, her phone pressed to her ear, her posture rigid with tension. Her voice, even from a distance, was sharp, low, and dangerous. At first, I was not going to eavesdrop, but curiosity, and a mother's instinct, has its own undeniable gravity. I ducked behind a long row of shopping carts just as her tone changed, becoming colder, more controlled. "I told you. It's handled," she whispered into the phone, her voice a venomous hiss. "No. Do not call me again. We handled it." Her words froze me where I stood. She was not talking about groceries. She turned her head, her eyes scanning the parking lot with a paranoid intensity. I slipped behind my own car just before her gaze could fall on me. My pulse was pounding so loudly in my ears that I could barely think. I waited, my heart hammering, until she finally drove away, and only then did I dare to move. When I got home, Thomas was waiting for me, a newspaper spread open on the kitchen counter. "It's out," he said, his voice flat. The headline was the same as the one from the draft, but now it was real, live, and being broadcast across national media outlets. The story explicitly named Pine and Lake as a financial front connected to Mercer Holdings, and it hinted at significant conflicts of interest in a case that the local police had hastily declared a simple robbery. Below the fold, there was a quote from a spokesperson for Gerald Mercer. "These baseless allegations are a desperate and defamatory attack on a respected business leader. Mr. Mercer has no connection, personal or professional, to any company called Pine and Lake," Thomas smirked. "He's already sweating." "You did it, Lillian." I did not feel victorious. I felt exposed. Because if Gerald Mercer was sweating, Chloe was the one who was taking off the gloves. Later that night, I sat by my front window, all the lights in the house turned off, watching the reflection of passing cars slide down the dark glass like silent red ghosts. I could not tell if they were just random cars, or if they were a reminder of who controlled this city's pulse. My burner phone pinged again with a new anonymous message. "You have started something that cannot be undone. Stay quiet now." I did not reply. I just looked at the newspaper again, at my son's smiling face staring back at me from beneath a headline that now carried the immense weight of everything we had lost. The next morning, I found another copy of the same paper lying on my front porch. There was no address label, no delivery bag, no note. Just a red circle, drawn in thick, angry ink, around the headline. I folded the paper slowly, my mind replaying Chloe's cold, menacing words from the parking lot. "Tell him we handled it." The grieving widow's performance was officially over. The audience had gone home. There is a moment when your entire world collapses, not with a loud, violent crash, but with the soft, rustling sound of a single piece of paper, the kind of silence that follows a verdict. That is what happened the morning Thomas walked into my kitchen, holding a plain manila envelope, his eyes grim and quiet, like a man carrying a burden too heavy for words. "I got it," he said, setting the envelope on the table between us. I did not need to ask what it was. For days, he had been relentlessly working his old channels, calling in favors, and cashing in decades-old debts from people in the system who still respected the badge he used to carry. He had said that if we could just get our hands on the internal financial subpoenas from Pine and Lake's now-frozen bank accounts, we might finally see who had moved the money that had paid for my son's murder. Now, that evidence sat between us. "Open it," I whispered, my voice hoarse. He slid the papers out of the envelope with a deliberate, careful slowness, flattening the top page against the table. My heart hammered against my ribs when I saw the bank's official letterhead, First Federal Corporate Division, Transaction Authorization Slip. There were 2 signatures required for the transfer. One on the top line, small and slanted, the elegant looping script of someone signing their name quickly, privately. The second signature, below it, was bold, sharp, and aggressive. Thomas pointed to the first signature. "Recognize that handwriting." I leaned in closer, my breath catching in my throat. The C looped in the exact same way it did on the old birthday cards Calvin had saved. The flourish at the end of the name was unmistakable. Chloe Mercer. The second signature, directly below it, was just as clear. Gerald L. Mercer. A profound, bone-deep cold seeped into me. The transaction amount was listed as $42,000. The description read, Consulting Services, Pine and Lake LLC, and the date of the transfer was exactly 1 week before my son died. My throat felt tight, constricted. She authorized the payment, I rasped. Thomas nodded grimly. And he approved it. Why did they both need to sign? I asked. That's the beautiful, sick genius of laundering money through a family business, he explained, his voice low and laced with a weary disgust. Chloe likely initiated the transfer using her executive access within the company. Gerald then signed off as the corporate guarantor. No one in the finance department would ever question a payment authorized by a married pair managing their shared corporate accounts, especially not when one of them has the chief of police on speed dial. I pressed my fingertips against the cold paper, as if my touch alone could somehow change the words printed there. This is her handwriting, Tom, I know it is. She signed the check that killed him. He hesitated for a moment. We don't know that for sure yet, Lillian. We just know she moved the money. I do, I said, my voice shaking with a terrible newfound clarity. I know. Because she looked me right in the eye, in my own home, just 2 nights ago, and lied about not even knowing what Pine and Lake was. She wore my son's watch on her wrist while she pretended to grieve for him. Now, her name is written at the beginning of the blood trail. He reached across the table and placed his hand gently on my wrist, grounding me. Lillian, listen to me. We have to move carefully now. You cannot confront her with this. Not yet. I don't need to confront her, I said, pulling my hand away. This signature already has. Thomas studied the paper again, his detective's eyes seeing more than just names and numbers. They moved a lot of money through this account, Lil. This isn't the first transfer. It's just the only one we've managed to catch so far. How much more? Hundreds of thousands, maybe more. But this is the one that matters. Because this one is personal. This one ties the two of them together in a conspiracy to commit murder. I stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the sky was a bruised, heavy gray, pregnant with a rain that had not yet begun to fall. The world smelled of ozone and metal. Do you think she ever even loved him? I asked quietly, not really expecting an answer. Thomas was silent for a long time. People like Chloe, he said finally, his voice soft, don't love another person. They love the reflection of themselves that they see in that person's eyes. And when that reflection stops being flattering, when it starts to show them their own flaws, they shatter the mirror. I turned back to face him. Then we will make damn sure that she is forced to see what she really looks like in every shard of broken glass. He carefully slid the damning document into a clear, protective plastic sleeve and labeled it in his neat, precise handwriting, Pine and Lake Dual Authorization. Then he looked up at me, his eyes filled with a sad, weary certainty, and he said something that I would remember long after this nightmare was over. Paper never lies, sis. People do. The rain finally began to fall, tapping against the window pane like a nervous, insistent warning. I watched the drops streak down the glass, each one breaking apart as it fell, and I wondered how many more truths would have to shatter before a single drop of justice could finally exist in this world. The envelope sat on the table, heavier now that we knew the weight of the secrets it carried. 2 names, 1 transfer, 1 motive, disguised as just another day of business. I whispered the words, almost to myself, a final, terrible realization. My son's killers shared a last name.